Hey, everybody, welcome back to the podcast. I'm excited today to have pastor, author, and theologian Kevin Sweeney. Kevin, thank you so much for being here today.
Yeah, I don't think anyone's referred to me as a theologian for like over 10 years, so I appreciate that. Just to start off, give me a little bit of cred with the people. Give them
Little hype.
the
I like to be the hype man
help
always.
help invite me in and get me ready. I appreciate that. Yeah, and I've said this to hopefully all, but probably most of the people hosting podcasts I've been on. As a first-time author, without seeing me on many other podcasts yet, because I'm just recording so many that
Sure.
haven't been out. I'm so grateful for the invitation, for the risk and the chance someone takes with the first time author that they're not as not familiar with. So, Tony, I'm grateful to be here. This is my first thing of the morning besides getting the kids out of the house for preschool. So it's 8:13 a.m. and I'm really grateful to be here with you.
Well, I want to jump right in and talk a little about. There's lots of different parts of your story that I want to dive into, but I'm curious how would you describe your calling? Because I've now looked at your story a little bit, and it's wide and diverse. And so, as you think about like if someone's like, "Man, Kevin, what has God called you to do?" How would you answer that question?
Hmm. That that's a great question. And I love how good questions, oftentimes like this simple question of asking somebody, what do you want? Has the capacity to cut through so much complexity and help lead people to
Mm,
so much clarity on what they want. And in this case, what is my primary energy going towards, right? There's all this diversity of ways we can participate in the unique thing the Spirit's doing in this world, this unfolding story of reconciliation and healing and movement towards justice, etc. But what is the unique way? How is our voice joined into that symphony? And for me, historically, you will see at times that the role of the mystic or the teacher is just simply to be an alarm clock,
mm,
where the mystic is the one who's an alarm clock inviting people to wake up. Wake up to what? How powerful they are. To wake up to that they have, just like everybody else, a unique role in this unfolding story of creation that God is still creating, right? It's amazing to think about it, but this unfolding, expanding universe, and somehow we're called to cultivate it and create for it and build for it. So I think a part of my role is just as an alarm clock to wake people up to the beauty and the mystery of this moment and the mystery and the gift of your child next to you who just wants to be seen,
mm.
and the importance and the sacredness of whatever the next thing you're working on and building is. So for me, it's not so much I'm trying to tell people what to do. I'm trying to help them wake up to experience the depth and the sacredness and the joy of what they're doing as they do it, and to clarify what that might be. So I'm just this, I texted a friend. I think he was on the show, Luke Norsworthy.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
He's like a new friend. Someone like introduced us, and I'm probably going to be on his podcast with this book. And I made a joke to him. I'm like, I'm just a voice calling out in the wilderness, to him while he's in a CrossFit gym or something. But
Right.
that's what it is. You embrace. I love for people to wake up and like, hey, this moment matters. Your life matters, and what you do matters. And also to wake up to somehow, like the mystics have told us historically, we're all okay here
Mm.
and safe and loved, and grace is present, and love is the deepest dimension of reality. And we can learn to rest and relax and settle into that and move beyond a lot of the grinding and grasping energy we have. So I guess I'm just an alarm clock, dude. That's all I'm doing here.
That man, that opens up a lot of different discussions. I think there's probably somebody who's listening who's going, "Okay, you're an alarm clock. How do I know if I'm asleep?"
Mm, that's a great question. That it is a and as like I'm a person who has been involved in the incarnational, practical, pastoral, real
Mhm.
people, real time, real life thing for about a decade. My wife and I started a church here almost 10 years ago. And the challenging part and the funny part about that question is we don't always know when parts of us are asleep
Oh, amen.
until the right alarm clock comes around and you're like, whoa, I settled. I actually settled into a place of just managing this relationship instead of giving my life to it. Oh, I need to wake up again to that. I need to be reminded of that. So the challenge is we don't always know when we're asleep, but we do know when we start to wake up. And we do know when a part of us starts to come alive of like, I didn't realize a part of me fell asleep to that dream and that desire because life and it was busy and I was surviving and I was scared and I was managing my life. And then all of a sudden I woke up. But I think joy is an indicator of when we're not sleeping, there's a sense of joy. I think when
Mm,
there's a sense of, man, I wake up and there is a clarity of focus on what I'm doing. That's the fruit of not being asleep. So joy, intentionality, taking risks, these are signs you're not asleep, so, which is a good thing. But that's the little mystery of being asleep is you don't know it until you. It's like being asleep. You don't know until you wake up and you're like, oh shoot, I just fell asleep. My kid just jumped on my face and now I'm awake.
yeah, I think, yeah, I think sometimes being asleep is a lot like being in a rut, right? And it's hard to
Mm,
know if we're in it or we're out of it, and sometimes you feel like you can see both sides. Now this
mm.
journey to being an alarm clock, this journey to this mantle that you wear as a mystic, how did you step into this calling, this part of your calling?
Mhm,
And maybe for a lot of our audience, we should define what a mystic is,
mm.
and take away some of any apprehension or fear that it's not some,
Sure.
witch doctor on the beach, you know?
Right, right. Well, I think what I hope people get from the book is, the feel of the mysticism of the everyday. And so I could say, the book is about non dual seeing, and it's also about choosing your kids over building a platform, right? There's
Mm,
this large cosmic vision that we have that's always expressed through the concreteness of this moment and this person. And I hope people can feel that natural scale where we're zooming out and have this broad perspective, then we're zooming in and actually being present in love. And, it's about pastoring from a liberated place that knows it has what it already seeks. So it's not the person who's seeking to get from other people. No, the truth is in what I'm giving, not what I'm trying to get from you. But on a practical level, the mystic is somebody who is defined by direct experience of God and of the sacred that transcends any particular beliefs we might have in any moment. So, the foundation of my life from the time I had this spontaneous awakening moment with God at 18 was not, oh, here's the beliefs I have about Jesus, or here's my understanding of God in a theological sense. I didn't have that. I wasn't in youth groups. I didn't know anything about any evangelical culture, youth groups. I never heard of these things as a teenager. I didn't know.
mm.
Sometimes I look back, I'm like, why didn't any kids ever invite me to youth group? And I'm like, well, probably because they heard how I was probably too far gone for them to think I would ever come at that point. But I had this spontaneous awakening moment that was direct, immediate experience of knowing, which for the mystic to know God in an experiential sense is always to be known by God, is to be seen by the eyes that are at the center of the universe that have a fixed gaze of love upon you that never changes. It's like Hebrews 6:19, this anchor for our souls is this fixed presence that doesn't change. And the from the beginning, my experience was not, let's talk about the details of the mango. It was like, let's just eat the mango. Or let's talk about all the ways to describe the ocean. It was like, let's just jump in and splash around. And we can discuss it. And when it comes to theology, and I have degrees in theology and I've done all those things. And of course, we're going to talk about it. Of course, we're going to make sense of it verbally. That's what we do. But the transformation and the life is in finding your life in the ocean, not having the right understanding of what salt water is. So I think for the mystic is a direct knowing and being known by God before, like, the foundation is not me holding on to anything. The foundation is me trusting that I'm being held by everything. And that's a very different starting point and a different continuing point in our life of faith.
What are your thoughts on why the church, specifically the North American church, is so apprehensive about embracing this idea? Right? It's because as I hear you talk about it, it makes perfect sense, and I I'm like, "Yeah, that
Like, it
no, that's
sounds
a
so good, it sounds
it's
great, I wanna splash in the
I wanna
ocean."
be in the ocean." Right, right. And yet I could go to any number of the amazing churches in my community, and, no one's talking about the ocean, so to speak, you know?
Mm,
Where's the tension in, our
mhm.
culture with this idea?
Well, I think, 1, you can't control people's experience,
Hmm.
and that you can't always systematize it, you can't always place it into neat categories. I mean, look at my story. I have a chapter in the book called Mushrooms and Missionaries, and it's about how if you look at the role of missionaries and, if you suspend missionary being caught up in a colonizing, white supremacist, Eurocentric, dominating, empire building endeavor, which that word is in many ways. But if you look at it in the positive, healthy sense of it, it's a missionary, someone who's pointing someone further towards Christ. That's a good thing.
Yeah.
Someone pointing someone further towards the way of Jesus. That's a beautiful thing. That's a big part of my life is doing that. And when when I tell that story, it's I tell the story of Thomas Merton, one of the great mystics of the 20th century, great Catholic monk. And early on in his life, when he was starting to get closer to his awakening experience, there was this famous Hindu monk, Mahanambrata Brahmachari, who was visiting the States, and he was, lecturing at probably some divinity schools or whatever. And Thomas Merton finds out he's doing it, and he kind of finds his way towards him. It's like after a conference or a church, you're like, hey, let's go talk to the pastor. No, wait, look, look. Oh, wait, there's an opening. Go, 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 boom, hey. And he had
Right?
his own he had his own version of that with this great Hindu teacher. And so Merton, as this young white male in the West, goes up to him and asks him for guidance. And then this Hindu monk brilliantly and amazingly doesn't point him to his own sacred texts from his tradition. He tells him to read St. Augustine's Confessions. He tells him to read Thomas à Kempis's Imitation of Christ. Let's say those get integrated into his journey. Thomas Merton is one of the most amazing Christians in the 20th century. I tell that story because I don't think it was in that Hindu monk's job description to be a missionary for Jesus.
Yeah.
But if you look at the functionality of that and the role, I'm like, he was pointing him further towards the fullness of life in Christ mysteriously. Now, in my journey, mushrooms, with the psychotropic property of psilocybin, as people know it, were the missionaries pointing me beyond themselves towards the fullness of truth and life and love and the ocean of the river of love of Christ. And I say that because when it comes to experience, man, this person said I was sitting under a tree and the light glittered a certain way, and all of a sudden I just felt a sense of connection with everything. What do there's no systematic theology for that, really. I mean, yeah, you can talk about natural revelation, you can talk about prevenient grace, and we have these helpful categories that are helpful, but it doesn't capture that experience. It doesn't you can't, it's not in its totality caught up in words. Or this person, my mother died, and when she left, all of a sudden I just knew the spirit was with me. Okay. This person, the love of my girlfriend at the time, who's now my wife, her seeing me for who I was as a teenager opened me up for the first time to trust that I'm seen by God. Okay, what do we do? So to me, I'm like, one, you can't control people's experience because it's beyond the categories that we have for a sense of control. And two, post enlightenment, modern, sophisticated, educated, highly rational, right brain people, like we've all been shaped to be, think faith can totally exist in the right side of our head with propositions and categories, and we think we are our beliefs. And when you have a direct experience of God, I have beliefs, but whoever I am in Christ is beyond and before whatever beliefs
Mm.
I have. So beliefs and experience have a commingling and important relationship, but they're not the same thing. There's a difference between spiritual intelligence, how we see God, reality, and humanity, and spiritual experience, a direct knowing. And I think we've been so right brain. We're like, to be a Christian is to have the right beliefs about Jesus. And the mystic and the experiential person says, no, to be a Christian or a person of faith is to be have a direct, immediate experience of the spirit who dwells within. and the beliefs are helpful, but they can't capture and categorize that. So it's a little scary for a pastor to hear my story, and be like, "So you ate mushrooms, and then a couple years later, you think you're going to be a pastor now? How does that work?" And yet, if you read the book, you're like, it actually makes sense when you see the trajectory of my life and an unusual experience. So, yeah,
Do you ever, and so you have 2 kids of your own who
three and a 5-year-old.
I've sufficiently Instagram stalked you. Are
Nice.
w would you give your kids mushrooms?
Oh, I mean, my
As a
kids, maybe they'll
missionary?
eat some
No, I'm
yeah,
just kidding.
I will my kids, I mean, one, if they eat some broccoli, I'll be happy, they're not big fans of even regular mushrooms. But I think the question of, obviously, 3 and 5-year-olds wouldn't be taking psychedelics, but
No,
let's
but
say they're
I mean,
older.
yeah. Yeah,
Yeah, they're older or teenagers. I tell people my book is not prescriptive at all, my
sure.
experience. My book is me just owning my own story. And
Right.
my story is when I sensed these psychedelics as a teenager, because I started taking mushrooms at 16 and stopped when I was 18, when I had the first direct encounter of God. For me, I always felt the mushroom saying yes, but keep going. Like, you're getting a glimpse, but there's the goal. There's a
Mm,
part of it you're seeing, but the truth is always beyond it. It was pointing me beyond itself. So I'm like, the mushrooms were signs, they were directions pointing me to the ocean. And once I got to the ocean, I had that experience. I was like, oh, I don't need the signs anymore because I'm here.
got it.
My life is not going back to just have a guaranteed experience or to the signs. That would be going backwards. They've pointing me to the source itself, which is God. My life is to wake up and stay in Christ through practices and meditation and silence for the rest of my life. And so even the question about my kids when they're older, or people in my church, for example, or whoever, is like, can I tell people a simple thing of, well, I think psychedelics are always evil and therefore no? Like, well, no, I can't say that. Do I ever directly prescribe them to people? No, I
Sure.
don't. And I'm somewhat ambivalent about the current resurgence, and focus on psychedelics and ketamine therapy and this. Because on the one hand, I can see, if you're looking at it, how those forms of therapy can produce positive effects in people's life. As a person who grew up in a culture of just doing drugs all the time, I also know most of the people I did psychedelics with, they're not enlightened gurus, they're not leaders for justice, they're not the leading voices of compassion, etc. They're just like to do drugs, So for me, I have that, like, I can't just give a blanket no to it, but I'm also not
Sure.
prescribing it. And I also think a lot of people just want to do drugs and get high because they make them feel groovy, and not everyone's on a conscious spiritual quest. And so to me, I have a lot of mixed feelings. But
Yeah,
I will
no,
say, no matter what people choose to do, the real work always happens after the peak experience. Whether you're doing
mm,
mushrooms or you're going to a big Christian conference or a deliverance night. Oh no, it's Burning Man. No, it's this next conference. Whatever thing people can have a peak experience of God on in different ways in different traditions. For me, whatever we see on the peak has to be transformed into who we are in the path. The
mm,
vision we get at the mountaintop has to become the values that are woven into the very depths of our being. And that work right there, of not just believing something strongly, but becoming it in your day to day life, that real work is always silence and solitude, life with God, over letting go of illusions and addressing the old hurt and pain, facing that, overcoming it, letting go, acceptance, forgiveness, courage. That's always the real work. So for anybody who's doing, regardless of what their peak moments are, I'm like, the real work is not Saturday night, it's Thursday morning and Wednesday afternoon. And are you going to choose to have that hard conversation with your partner today? That's the real work. Are you going to practice acceptance and forgiveness when things didn't go your way? That's the real work. So to me, I'm, regardless of how people see that, that is always the work. Is Friday night when the high is over, who are we and what are we doing now in our intentional life?
yeah, one of the things we say around here a lot is that if you're not dedicated to your disciplines, you'll be destroyed by your distractions.
It's so
A
good.
and so I am curious, what are some of the daily things that you do to keep the right, heart.
Mm. Yes. No, I love that question because it's directly connected with what we're talking about. There's
Yeah.
the peak experience, then there's the everyday path of us. What are the practices that help a person consciously experience their true self, directly experience the grace and love of God? So each morning when we do that, we begin with the conclusion.
Mm,
Whatever your ego wants to go grind and grasp for and fight for and try to earn from others, if you wake up in that place for 20 minutes of silence, this moment of how whatever practices you have, it is a direct experience of, oh, everything a part of me wants to go hustle for has been given to me as a gift. And
mm,
each morning I can slowly and silently allow grace and the spirit and the presence of God to open me up, undo me, allow all of that to flow in, put me back together. I can begin my day of the fact I already know who I am. So what I would just tell people, whatever practices are helping you directly know that you're loved, help you stop long enough to experience the spirit that's like, hey, it's already here in the breath, the miracle, the gift, the gospel, grace, it's in the breath within you and it's already here. So for
mm,
me, that would be 20 minutes of silence. I do every time I'm in silence, I do this breath practice. It takes about 8 minutes that helps me be present. I mean, if you really want to know details, I could tell you the practicality of that. And then the next 12 minutes or so in the 20 minutes is me having this slow, loving dialogue and conversation with God. Sometimes I will use books from the mystics that I've already read as like a form of Lectio Divina. So I'll pull out this Ken Wilber book or a Richard Rohr book or a Mirabai Star book. And I don't read it because reading will take you so into your head, it takes you out of your body and your heart, but I just look at one line that says something about this phrase, ever present awareness. And
mm,
I'm like, I just sit with that one phrase of, besides all of the objects arising in our awareness, there's this ever present awareness, this ever present presence of God that never moves. And I'll sit with that for a minute. And I might say a couple more words where I'm not really saying a lot, I'm just kind of saying a little bit. And it's actually the energetic and loving space between the words that is my life that I'm taking in the moment. So I have a practice of 20 minutes of some version of that. That is my usual thing. And all of a sudden, I want to begin my creative life, my building, my whatever work I have to do of compassion and justice or waking up, etc., to say, oh, I'm not going out there trying to earn the name that is directly given to me by God that I can wake up and trust each
mm,
and every morning. And whatever practice helps a person do that, that's what they should do more. If you need to go on a walk for 20 minutes because you have a monkey mind that can't sit still, go take the walk. The walking meditation and your body moving will help your mind and your heart and body align. That's great. Do that. If hanging upside down on moon boots somehow helps you be present, and you're like, the blood rushes to my head and I can't think, and I go for it because all spiritual practices are fingers pointing to the moon. They are not the point. They are pointing us beyond themselves towards the reality of God and the presence of love. And whatever practices help ground us in that, we have to return to that over and over and over. Just like we return to our lovers and our spouses, we return to our kids when we sometimes forget and we're busy doing stuff. We return again and again, and we're like, this is everything's here. Everything is right here, and then I can continue my life after that.
Do you have any suggestions or thoughts on finding, resources that help point us in that direction? Like,
That's a
I'm
great
imagining
question.
that there's a lot of people who are just don't know how to really sit in silence. They've never really done a walking meditation. These
Mm.
kind of, um, again, not maybe not prescriptions necessarily, but
No, yeah,
practices that
yeah.
can be tried. Yeah.
I think about it, that's such a great question because I think about, like, contemplation and meditation and prayer as, like, a wide open field. Or, like, say
Mm,
you go to a new place, like a botanical gardens, and they're like, "Hey, go explore," and you're like, "But without a path and a legend and a map, I don't how do I feel overwhelmed, I don't know where to start.
mm,
Can I eat these mangoes off the tree? Can I climb this tree? Should I just sit here? I don't wanna miss anything, so now I'm just like a chicken with my head cut off running around." And that's why practices are like a path through a field, that through the specific path, they help you experience the beauty of the whole.
Mm,
So, in our own tradition, for example, something like the prayer of examen. Ignatius's prayer of examen, anybody can Google prayer of examen and you will find multiple versions of it. But the prayer of examen is a contemplative way of looking back at your day and saying, where was my heart closed? Where was my heart open? Where did I sense God? Where did I shut down? And it helps you reorganize your way through the sacred sort of thread of the spirit, and also help you connect with God in the process. That's a great practice and a path through the life of the spirit. Another one would be, I mean, I'm trying to think. There's so many good. Like, look up Lectio Divina, Lectiodivina. There, you'll find guides on Lectio Divina. How do you read the scriptures in a contemplative, sort of silent and slow way, where you allow the sacred text to become your guide through a time of contemplation? Those are probably the two most practical and well-known
mm.
Lectio Divina, prayer of examen, that people do. If some and the funny thing is, there was a guy from our church years ago. We were talking about practices and being grounded. And when we talked about silence, I said, look, if you commit, let's say 4 times a week, 20-minute sits, that's a kind of a common contemplative sit, 20-minute sits 4 times a week for 5 years, you'll start to get it. When it comes to like pure silence, because it's hard.
Sure.
Like, it's like what you said about disciplines and distractions. Spiritual disciplines,
Yeah.
it requires discipline. I have had a practice of silence for like 20 years, because my life
Wow.
started with that, right? I started with direct experience. I started with silence. I didn't start with forms and beliefs. I didn't have that yet. That came later. And still to this day, I still feel resistance within me going into a time of silence, because it requires something from me the rest of my day to day life doesn't. And I tell people, what do you do in silence? Nothing. That's why it's so hard,
Right.
because we're good at doing. Can I check this in to do list? I just did 20 minutes of nothing. Let me just click that off. Like, I'm like, it requires nothing, but it costs you everything.
Yeah.
That's the paradox of the mystic says, in silence you experience a nothingness, and in that nothingness you discover everything. And
Mm,
it's just a commitment to return to over and over. Hey, that's when there's a great story, Thomas Keating, like the sort of this father of centering prayer in the West.
sure.
And there's this story, I think it was like this nun who came up to him after a talk, and she's like, "Father, I, tried, centering prayer," which, is something he kind of helped awaken people to. "I tried centering prayer and I'm just so miserable at it. I feel like I lost my train of thought 10,000 times." And Thomas Keating, in his like, wisdom and grace, looks at her and says, it's 10,000 opportunities to return to God. And in our life of silence and prayer, and in our life as in our relationships,
Sure.
think about it, when you're married, there's 10,000 opportunities to return to your spouse and be like, hey, that wasn't okay. I'm sorry. Can we begin again? That teshuva, that Hebrew word to return, which is really the gift of the word repenting, to turn into return. We don't just return to God, we return to each other. We return to our
Yeah.
true selves again and again and again. And spiritual practices are like that. Oh, I didn't do it for a week. Hey, the mystery of the gospel is that the spirit's just like, whenever you're ready, let's begin again. And that's how prayer works too.
So God's really been like almost nudging my heart about this silence thing. And last year I did my first silent retreat um,
Wow.
for 3 days. It was horrible. It was
uh,
I signed up again to go again this year because again because I know I need it, right? Like it was yes, it was really hard because I'm a talker and I'm a verbal processor. And did I walk up and down these country roads and talk to myself? I might have, and that's
mm,
okay, right? But I'm up
mm,
to 3 to 5 times a week. I sit in silence for I'm up to 10 minutes now. Um,
wow.
and it's like you said, it's kind of it's a constant work in progress, and that's
Mm,
good, I guess. That's I like to find those edges in my life where God's clearly working, and this is definitely
Mhm,
it. How did you
mhm.
I mean, I know you've been doing this for a long time. How do you encourage people when it feels like they're failing at it? Or can you fail at it?
Well, I think failure in those terms is so defined in by
Sure,
cultural
yeah.
ways and whatever we carry. So it's like the story of that nun. She felt like a failure because in a 20-minute sit, her mind wandered 10,000 times. But the real juice, the real important thing is not whether or not your mind wandered, it's whether or not you have the courage to return. And I would zoom out and say that's true for just anything in life. You
Yeah.
know, when you start to have the edges of your idealism and kind of sandpapered out by the crucible of real life, which you do as a leader and a pastor and a spouse or whatever, as a parent, you're like, oh, this nothing is what I thought it was, you know, and that's okay. The sooner you can accept that and let go of it, the more you're ready to open up to what God really wants to create it to be because you've let go of your idealisms now. And I think it's just it's the art of returning again and again and again to the practice. You know, there's been times in my life and I'm quite comfortable in silence where I'm like, oh, like when I'm in my 20s or whatever, a couple weeks went by, I'm like, I haven't sat in intentional silence for whatever the reasons are.
Hmm.
And then I just return and then we keep going. And that to me is one of the great gifts. You know, when Richard Rohr says something like all the great mystics and all the great knowers of God throughout history, they've never met a dictator, they've always met a lover in God.
Hmm.
And that's the gift of silence, and that's a gift of really knowing God is you're like, God is not one who shames, manipulates, coerces, um, forces you to replay the past because they're just harassing you. No, every time you return, as Revelation, I believe 3:20 says, you know, that knocking at the door imagery is like really This is something that amazes me: the humility and vulnerability of a God who says, "Whenever you're ready, let's begin." You know,
Hmm.
we feel like we don't realize it, but we have a lot of conditions on allowing people to return. You know, even as a
Sure.
pastor, there's a lot of temptations of like the ego could say, I did this, this, and this for you, and you didn't show appreciation. Therefore, next time you come back, I'm actually going to withhold or keep distance, or I might have a personality that kind of like shames you and manipulates you to do what I want, because et cetera. No, we learn it to be shaped into the image of Christ likeness is to embody the same love that's like, I will offer you guidance. I will love you. I will go with you, but I will do so. And it's your call how far I go with you, when I go with you, how I go with you. The humility of that spirit who consistently does that and never shames us when we return for me is when you talk about waking up to that
Yeah.
reality is a powerful thing. I can return again to the open arms of a mother, to the warmth of a father, to the embrace of a sister, to the friendship of a brother, to the closeness of a friend. God is all of those things and more every single time we return. And when it comes to spiritual practices, it's the same thing. You didn't do it for a week. It's okay. You can return. Your
Yeah.
mind wandered and you're thinking about you're going over you just had in 10 seconds you practiced what you were going to say in a podcast, gave a speech in front of people and said how you're going to tell that person off and you're like, I'm supposed to be praying right now. What am I doing? And then we return and we're like, to me, I'm like, I say this playfully to myself all the time, not in a real shaming way, but as a joke. I'm like, I'm an idiot because I
Right.
am, you know, I'm like, I'm an idiot and I'm a saint at the same
Hmm.
time. And I when I made that mistake, I'm like Mirabai Starr, this great living mystic whose work I just love. She says the ego is a practical joke that we keep falling for.
Mm.
That little part of your ego that's like, no, you better prove to them why you're important. Hey, they don't know about your accolades. You better tell them. You better give them your resume. That's just the insecure ego who still feels the need to prove ourselves to people who are around instead of letting ourselves be who we are. And our ego wants to do that. And sometimes we fall for it. And when we do afterwards, God's not beating us up and shaming us over it. It's just kind of
Sure.
like this smile of like, oh, I did that again because I'm an idiot. And now it's time to return to my true self, you know? And there's the graciousness of allowing ourselves to return is not just big in practices, but in everything in
Yeah.
life. The grace to return is everything.
That's beautiful. I'm curious. and if this is too personal, don't feel like you have to answer. God is clearly working in your life now as for the last 10 years, you've been leading a local urban church. And as you've very publicly shared that that season is coming to an end. And so I always love to hear from people. How do you know when God is nudging you that one thing ends and the next thing begins? And I'm also really curious, what's the next thing for you?
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you asked the question. I have no problems talking about this at all, but I appreciate you framing it in that way, in such a caring and thoughtful way. Something that I stay with me that has always exists within me when I think about seasons and where we're giving our energy to is the moment the moment you're not willing to suffer for your art anymore, things are changing, right? That's from
Mm,
an artist perspective. But that could be the moment you're not willing to suffer for your calling, your vocation, or whatever it is. Because the hard work, the sacrifices, when you really love something and you
mm,
really are staying true to your vocation, that your voice, that Latin word vocare, you do the hard stuff for it, and even though it's hard, it's still held within the envelope of, "Man, I love all this, and I will. Oh, this person's late to the bar setting up. I'll start to set up by myself. Yeah, I wish somebody else was here, but, like, that's okay."
yeah.
You show up early, you stay up late sometimes, you do this because the hard work is a part of it, and that's a great gift when you have that. It's amazing. When things start to shift, so COVID hits, obviously, and for Imagine, for our church, it sucks because we had just went through this transition. We brought on our first, like, other person on staff besides my wife and I, who's like my best friend out here, Larry, and it went well. And he's just, he's doing his thing, and we transitioned into a new space, which was like a big risk and a big move. And we transitioned, and we're like, man, that really became everything we hoped it would be. And it's like this
Mm,
great space and this great co-working space out here. We're in there for 6 months or so, and then COVID hits. And over time, like 90% of the energy I spent day to day pastoring stopped. It just did. The changes in Hawaii was
yeah,
always one of the strictest states when it came to stuff. So we had
sure.
even more restrictions. And that's when I started writing. I didn't go into it planning to write. This book came out of it. Life is not always this romantic. It just happened for me in this moment where I was up in the mountains here in Hawaii in a time of silence. And it was like a snap of a fingers. And I was like, that's a book. And I came home and just singularly focused on this book for like 3 to 4 months, and it was like done. Like something, it was
Wow.
like work like that. Yeah, that's the book, Making of a Mystic, by the way. And my life started, the day to day started to shift where I'm like, man, all this energy is now in writing. And obviously with my kids, they were young at the time, even younger, not in preschool, and doing things. And when last fall, after not meeting for 18 months, we would do once a month, like, let's do an outdoor thing or whatever.
Yeah.
But after 18 months of not meeting consistently, my wife and I sensed there is this chapter for Imagine to be born again.
Mm,
And we really believed that. And we were willing to open our hearts again. We were willing to take that risk again. We were willing to go all in again. As hard as that is after 10 years and COVID, it's not an easy thing to do. We were there. And after watching the Michael Jordan documentary on Netflix, The Last Dance, which I grew up playing basketball, like I've watched that, I want to say 5 times. I'm not
sure.
joking. And we were like, we knew in our hearts this is the last dance.
Yeah.
Like, this is a 2 to 3 year chapter of rebuilding. And in this role, which I always sensed I would do for about 10 years, like, this is the last time. But about 4 to 6 weeks into reopening, I started to get this sense of, this is the last chapter. And it's not a 2 to 3 year chapter of rebuilding. It's the last chapter, and this is it. And it's a
Mm,
chapter of closing it down. And my metaphor for Imagine started to shift into one of hospice care.
mm,
Because I'm like, the way you relate to somebody when you're fighting for their life and trying to prolong their life is very different from the moment you come to terms with there's an expiration date. And the goal now is not duration and it's not quantity, it's quality, and how present can I be to this person, to this living being, which is how I see the church, as a living entity.
yeah.
And so, we started to make that shift. And the acceptance, the letting go, like the things like when you're not willing to suffer for your art, I'm like, the things I used to do for 7 years, the thought of doing some of those things now and exerting that much energy feels impossible to me.
Mm.
It just feels, dude, there's no way I would ever do that. I'm like, but I did that for 7 years. And I can start to, there was a moment where I was like, I have all kinds of imagination and ideas for the future, and none of it has to do with imagine.
Mm.
It has to do with a life after imagine. And I'm paying attention to that. Oh, I still have all of this creative energy in me that wants to build and create and be that alarm clock and do, but oh, none of it seems like it's filtered through the community. Oh, I can feel my body and heart and mind shifting towards the next season. And this is what I tell people when it comes to, like, my wife's a marriage and family therapist, and she was a pastor too. She's a pastor at Imagine. And I talked to her about this idea of clarity and courage, where I'm like, you go to therapy and there's some moments and some chapters of therapy where you're seeking clarity. Why do I do this? Why do I keep returning to this pattern? Why do I feel stuck? Why am I whatever? But once you have clarity, clarity is no longer the issue. The issue now is to have the courage to make decisions out of that clarity. You have the clarity. Oh, guess what? In the end, you just have to forgive your father, which for some of you, it's like 40% of you, right now.
Right.
So I'm like, you have the clarity, but now it's not about clarity. It's about having the courage to forgive, which is a
Yeah.
whole different, that involves your body. The other one's just in your mind. And so when I had that clarity of, oh, this is a transitional season, well, now I need the courage. My wife and I, like, is this really where we are? We have to make this decision together. Now we have to return, have that conversation with people multiple times. We have to make a plan for the end of how to be faithful to this. And also the courage where your ego, your insecure ego could be like, what are people going to think? Are people going to think this is a failure? Are they going to think COVID and we just
Mm.
COVID destroyed another church? Do we not have what it takes? Your ego will be so fearful of what people will think. But if you're grounded, like I said, as the mystic and the true self in Christ, you're like, that is all out of my control. And my job is not to manage other people's perception of me or other people's narrative about imagine. My job is to be faithful to what I sense the spirit has invited us into from the beginning. And that's all I'm supposed to do. And I think that's a big thing is when you feel like you have less and less energy to suffer and sacrifice for the thing that you love. And when your imagination starts to take you to other places creatively, it's possible you're heading towards some edges of the transition. The spirit's inviting you into something new, which will require a tremendous amount of courage to
Yeah.
take that, like, to tell the story of a defining moment for this chapter. We surprised our kids with a trip to New York City, like Christmas night, so we took them there because I was telling my daughter all about it. It was awesome. And one of my last days there, I spent some time in silence and in prayer walking the High Line, which is like this outdoor park in New York City. And it was a very slow, contemplative, like dialogue out loud with God as I'm walking, which I'm sure disturbed the people who were passing me by and walking much faster. I was walking really slow and talking to myself. And in that moment, I thought to myself, oh, it seems like every 10 years, my life is completely upended.
Hmm.
At 18, after that spontaneous experience of God, I walked away from playing sports in college. I walked away from a possibility of a career in music. I moved away where my girlfriend was in Hawaii at the time and started over when nobody understood and people were very disappointed. But I knew what I was doing. At 28, I did the same thing moving back to Hawaii to start Imagine. Financial risks and none of this makes sense. And yet, here's what we're doing because I sense the spirit calling us into it. Big risk at 28 moving back. And I'm like, whoa, I'm 37 and I'm about to turn 38 in 2022. And I think to myself, it appears I'm approaching another one of those big risks. And as we get older, the older we get, the harder it is to take risks.
Hmm.
Because I'm not 22. My wife and I are like, let's both have restaurant jobs and just pay the bills and go to school. That's it. What risks do we have? Like they're real, but it's different. There's a different
Right.
gravity
Yeah, yeah.
and weight when I have two kids and I have a wife, and we have a life together and we have a place we live. But to me, the freedom to keep following the invitational pull of the loving spirit wherever it calls me is the foundation of my life, wherever it takes me. And to start over at 38 is really scary and it's hard. But I'm approaching the edge again, and I'm like, "Hey, this is another one of those times," and it makes no sense to some people, but deep down, just like the other ones, I know exactly what I'm doing. And yes, it's uncertain, and yes, I don't have all the details, but it seems that's how this whole thing works sometimes. You have to be willing to say yes to the next 2 steps when you don't know what step 13 and 14 are feel like, and you just have to trust the next 2, and the unfolding path happens in this co-creative process of the invitation of God and the courage of us to keep going. And
Mm.
as a mystic whose life is built on just trusting the spirit, I'm like, I'm quite comfortable with all that ambiguity and uncertainty because it's an adventure. I'm like, to me, this whole thing's an adventure. I'm like, we love adventure movies. We love Lord of the Rings, but I'm like, to Frodo and Sam, that was a real risk. They thought they
Right.
would be killed. You had the vantage point to know, well, they're going to make it. No, but in your life, yes, 10 years later, you'd be like, hey, that's what happened. But in the moment, it's a real risk. And you could lose everything or break through to this next chapter of your life. And to me, when you're young, faith is about what you believe. When you get older, faith is about how much you're willing to risk for the sake of truth and love. And
Mm.
so that's where I'm at again, and it's it's real, and I'm also like, man, I have all this energy and excitement for the future after the real work of letting go of grieving the old.
Yeah. That's really good. That's worth the price of admission right there. So, I have one more question for you, but before I ask
Mm.
it, I know that my listeners are going to connect on with you all over the interwebs. Where is the best place to pick up their copy of the book and to learn more about the work that God has called you to?
Yes, May 31st. Me and my publisher are not doing pre-orders for specific reasons, but May 31st on Amazon, Kevin Sweeney, The Making of a Mystic, subtitle, My Journey with Mushrooms, My Life as a Pastor, and Why It's Okay for Everyone to Relax, which I just love saying that, by the way. May 31st, find that. The best way to follow day to day, especially leading up to the book and what I'm working on, is on Instagram at Kevin Sweeney1. And I also have my own podcast called The Church Needs Therapy, where half of it are with guests, half are me doing my own teaching. So that's where some of my energy goes to as well. So those are probably the best places to start and follow along. Thank you for asking.
Yeah, I listened to one of your podcast episodes today, as a matter of fact, and prepping for our time together, and it's really good. Some deep thoughts, is good thoughts though. So
Mhm.
I encourage everybody
Uh,
to go hit that subscribe button wherever you listen to
Thanks, Tony.
podcasts, and make sure you don't miss it.
Appreciate
Okay,
that.
last question. I always love to
Yes,
ask
sir.
people. It's an advice question, except I'm going to ask you to give yourself one particular piece of advice, and I get to name the day and the time. And so I'm going to take you back to your first Sunday as the co-pastor of Imagine Church 10 years ago today, or not today, but ten years ago from today. If you could pull a chair up in front of that younger version of yourself, that young, energetic young man, and sit knee to knee with him and look him in the eyes, what's the one piece of advice you're going to give him?
Mm. I would the same piece of advice I would give to the 28-year-old starting Imagine
Hmm.
is the same piece of advice I would give to the 18-year-old who just had that experience of God, who's going to leave everything and move away. And it would be some version of everything you sense deep down and is true and real is, and just trust that.
Hmm.
Because I didn't have those kinds of guides. When I started the church, I had some, friends and pastors come alongside of me, and I was also doing things different in my own ways than some of them. And at 18, to have that experience I had, which I had to I had to trust my own inner compass of the presence of the spirit within me. And I would just say what I wished somebody else would say to me, but never did, to be like, hey, everything you experienced is real. Everything you sense about where you're going is true and good. Just keep going.
Mm.
And I didn't have that, and I had to trust that. So I would go back and basically just reaffirm what I sensed I all was there. And to broaden this out for a sec, I have a chapter in the book called like vicarious value. I forget what the chapter is, but it's a story about how our ego has all these fantasies when we go to a conference and we're like the main speaker, whoever our kind of main person is at the time. It's Richard Rohr. No, it's this person. No, it's that person. And we think we're gonna go there and the speaker's gonna like single us out, call us up in front of people and be like, everybody, this is the one right here. This is the one you need to listen to. This is the one who has all the answers. Please, like, he's the one basically. And we all think that's gonna happen, like, I'm gonna be best friends with this person, or maybe they're gonna, like, whatever.
Sure.
And I think to myself, "Well, what is that? I mean, what do we really desire from that?" Because
Mm.
I feel like it's a pretty common thing to have beneath the surface. What are we looking for in that if that statement happened? Validation, permission, affirmation? And to me, while it's normal to want those things from an authority figure, we don't need them.
Yeah.
Because the authorizing presence and power of the spirit within is already whispering, that's true about you.
Mm.
You can do that. The gift you sense you have. The thing you think you can create, you can. The part of you that you think is special that you have to give to this world, it is. And the authorizing presence and power of the spirit's like, just do that and trust that and give your life to it. And
Mm.
so for me, it's great to have that when you have leaders and mentors affirm those things within you. It's so powerful. But on a deeper level, there's times where to step into the fullness of our voice, we have to trust the spirit within us saying that's already true. You're looking for that person to confirm what you already know. And I'm telling
Mm.
you it's real and keep going. So that's what I would say to that kid is whatever you sense, just keep going. Yeah.
That's so good, man. Kevin, I'm so thankful for your generosity of your time today and your heart and for this writing and just praying for what God's going to do through this book.
Mhm.
And hopefully it does get a whole lot of people to relax a little bit.
Mm. Yes. And for someone like yourself, Tony, I feel like one of my things I bring to the world when I have friends who are great, like I'm so horrible. There's so much of leadership and pastoral leadership I'm terrible at. It's like I joke with my friends 6 years into the church, I'll still Google like what to do in a meeting when I'm responsible for running it. So there's so many parts of leading I had to like grow into so many weaknesses organizationally, and I'm grateful for that time. But when I have friends who are higher capacity, really like let's get stuff going, that apostolic, the entrepreneurial,
Hmm.
someone I don't know you well enough, but someone who does things and leads, I feel like I'm like the brother who's like, hey, and also this is all for you too.
Yeah.
All the joy you want for other people is for you. The rest, that's why when you said help people relax, and that's what I think I can bring to people. It's like I can't do what other people do on that level of leadership, but also to me, I'm like, and this is also all for us to enjoy. And I want to help my friends who bring so much good into the world also experience the goodness and the depths of their being. And so for you, for all my friends who are like that, people listening in, that's what I hope for everybody. So good, so grateful for this time, man. And I look forward to staying in touch, man, as things unfold. And I appreciate the prayers, however they come.
Absolutely.